Hello and welcome back. I have something to read. I'm not going to say who this is from. I'm just going to read the comment. It says, "The ego is not a false self. It's very much real. You can grow out of that perspective and integrate ego into the totality of your being. But as long as that's where you currently are, that's where you operate from. Pervasive patterns are real." Let's go deeper into the ego here. Let's go a bit deeper. In one perspective, there's some truth to that comment, but only from a certain perspective. In the same way that when you look at the light of the moon from where we stand, it seems to be real. A person could argue and argue and argue and say, the light of the moon is real. It's right there. And in one way, they would be correct. It does seem to shine. It does seem to have a light of its own. But we know ultimately that that light comes from the sun. And to say that the ego is real and not false is the same thing, basically. It comes from a misunderstanding of what a person really is. You can grow out of that perspective and integrate ego into the totality of your being. The ego is useful, there's no doubt. I'm just going to change the position here. I think I'm going to get sun right in my eyes in a second. It's very useful. The human race wouldn't have gotten to where it was or is without the ego. Individually, many people would have died without their ego. It's useful for survival in the same way that the light of the moon can help you to see in the dark. And you can use that light, it can be useful. But when we're speaking about the ego, there is no integration. You cannot to integrate the ego into your being is to have the ego fool you into thinking you are it again. On one perspective, if looked at from one side, you can say that integrating the ego is the same way as putting the ego in its place and using it from the perspective of your being. And in that way, that statement is a very truthful and very deep understanding. But in reality, you can't integrate something that's not real. You can't say, I integrate the light of the moon into my existence. You say, I integrate the light of the sun that reflects on the moon, from the moon, if you will. You see, the ego will do its best to try to stay, to remain there. In the statement, from the perspective that this comment was made is very much from the perspective of yoga, the more dominant or masculine approach to spirituality, which is a great path. And there's nothing wrong with anything in that comment at all. My only concern when it comes to the ego is that it's very good at convincing you to stick around, to keep it around. It's very good at having a person believe in it, in its usefulness. I mean, in reality, light is important. Here, if you want to see where you're going, so the light of the moon might be useful in this 3D reality. But when it comes to spiritually, an illusion, a false light, can be quite dangerous. Part of you can value it, and it can become very difficult to drop the ego. You see, the ego is very good at separating itself from others, regardless of what form it takes. It will compare. The ego will compare itself to others. And ultimately, the ego isn't real. So ultimately, there is no integrating the ego. In the same way that when you're dreaming at night, you can't say that person is the dream. You can't say that his consciousness is the dream. The dream is an illusion. Can you say that an illusion is real? Can you say that a thought is real? And the ego, ultimately, is a bundle of thoughts that are held together with a sense of me, I. They're thoughts held together that are categorized and held together in form of I statements. We take all these thoughts and we put them together, and when they relate to the sense of I, this is the ego. This is what we call the ego. The perspective that the ego fails to see is that you are the entity that sees the ego. When I am looking at a rainbow, I am not the rainbow. I see the rainbow. And a rainbow is very much like the ego. It's not actually there. It's just thoughts. I, as the deeper sense of being, sees all these I statements, feels emotions that are attached to a thought which give the sense of I. The deeper I can witness this the same way that I, not as the ego, but I can see a rainbow. So to say that the ego is real is really a misunderstanding of what the ego is. In this comment and in the approach of yoga, what remains true is that the person does not want to drop the ego itself. The ego is speaking through the person, cleverly, very sneakily, trying to remain on top of the throne. And ultimately, the ego is only when you believe you are your thoughts. In the same way that you believe a rainbow is real until you find out otherwise. Until you realize, you go there and you try to touch it. So I can understand where the person is coming from at the same time. From their perspective, they're completely right. Until you go to the rainbow and touch it, you will believe that it is real. But ultimately, it never was. So this video is a warning. A warning to anyone on the spiritual journey about the very, very, very subtle tricks to the masculine approach of the ego. To be very, very careful with how you say things. Very, very careful in your choice of words. Because when you say things in a certain way, the voice of the ego may be behind there fooling you. The voice of the ego might not want to let go, and you might not be able to recognize that you as well are dreaming. Because the only freedom from the ego and the illusion itself is to drop the ego altogether. It's not even to go to the rainbow and touch it to see that it's not real. It's to just let it all go completely. These things are very difficult to talk about because the ego, when you get to a certain point, it becomes very difficult to detect. And ultimately, there is no ego at all. To categorize something as ego and say this is ego gives it power. And this is another thing that I worry about. Worry might not be the right word, but and concerned about in these types of statements. When you say and believe the ego is real, you give it power. Belief is the most dangerous thing that you can do. Belief should be dropped altogether and replaced with trust earned through experimenting yourself. If you don't know, you don't know. That's the best one can really say. To say you believe is to give power into something and make it real. You make that real by saying you believe, or by simply just believing. So when you believe the ego is real, it's almost as though, well, it's not as though, when you believe the ego is real, you create it, and then you need to take it down. You create the fight, the struggle, and you're fighting against yourself. Can you see? When you come to a deeper understanding and a realization that there is no ego at all, that there's only energy flowing, then you live in a state of forgiveness, acceptance, and then when you see other people in their ego, it has much less of an effect on you. You don't believe the person is wrong. It doesn't give you a standpoint to say, there's this and this. There's no comparison. That person is an ego, that person is not an ego. There's no separation. Do you see? There's no unity or oneness. Love can't flow through you. You are not connected to who you really are when you're comparing. When you understand that ego is nothing more than man's categorization of personality traits, of human tendencies, that it doesn't actually exist, in the same way that the letter P doesn't actually exist, but is a reflection of a sound. P, p. It's a human creation. And to say that it's real, from one perspective, you can say the letter P is real when you draw it on a piece of paper. But ultimately, we know the letter P doesn't exist. But it doesn't mean we can't use it. In the same way that the ego truly doesn't exist. A lot to meditate on in this video. I leave you with that. Wherever you are around the world, whatever time it is that you're watching this video, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate you. Peace.